There is a question most people never say out loud, but almost everyone has asked themselves at 2 a.m., staring at a ceiling. Why do some people seem to win again and again, while the good ones keep finishing last? Why does the quiet, calculating coworker get promoted over the loyal, hardworking one? Why does the person who plays every move 3 steps ahead always seem to land on their feet, while the person who simply does the right thing gets used, exhausted, and left behind? We tell ourselves stories about fairness. We tell ourselves that kindness always wins in the end. But somewhere in the back of your mind, you already suspect the truth is more complicated than that. 500 years ago, a disgraced Italian diplomat sat alone in exile, stripped of his title, his power, and his reputation, and he wrote something so honest about human nature that it terrified the world for centuries afterward. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli, and the book was called The Prince. Today, we are not just going to talk about a book. We are going to talk about a brain. Your brain. Because hidden inside the architecture of human psychology is a trait that explains why some people manipulate, why some people get manipulated, and why understanding this single concept might be the most important psychological upgrade you make this year. This is the Machiavellian brain. Let's clear something up immediately, because the word Machiavellian has been twisted into a cartoon villain costume. In pop culture, it just means evil schemer. But in psychology, Machiavellianism is something far more precise, far more measurable, and far more relevant to your daily life than you think. In 1970, 2 psychologists named Richard Christie and Florence Geis did something nobody had done before. They took Machiavelli's political philosophy and asked a strange question. What if this isn't just a theory of statecraft? What if it's a personality trait that ordinary people carry inside them in different doses, like a psychological fingerprint? They built a measurement tool called the Machiavelli scale, and what they discovered reshaped personality psychology forever. Machiavellianism turned out to be a real, stable, measurable trait built on 4 core ingredients. The first is a cynical worldview, a deep-seated belief that people are fundamentally self-interested and that idealism is naive. The second is a willingness to manipulate others strategically to get what they want. The third is a focus on personal goals over moral ones, prioritizing winning over being liked or being right in some abstract ethical sense. And the fourth is what researchers call tactics, a set of calculated social behaviors like flattery, deception, charm, and strategic distance, deployed almost like chess moves. Later, in 2002, psychologists Delroy Paulhus and Kevin Williams placed Machiavellianism alongside 2 other traits, narcissism and psychopathy, and called this trio the Dark Triad. Narcissism is about ego and self-image. Psychopathy is about a lack of empathy and impulse control. But Machiavellianism sits apart from both of them because it is not driven by vanity and it is not driven by impulsiveness. It is driven by strategy. A high Machiavellian mind is patient. It is calculating. It does not need to be loved, and it does not act on impulse. It asks one question before almost every decision. What is the most effective path to my goal? And then it walks that path, regardless of whether the path is paved with charm, with silence, with loyalty, or with betrayal. Here is the part that should make you sit up. Almost nobody scores at 0 on this trait, and almost nobody scores at the absolute maximum. Machiavellianism exists on a spectrum, and you are somewhere on that spectrum right now. The real question isn't whether you have a Machiavellian brain. The real question is how much of it you have, whether you understand it, and whether you are using it or whether it is quietly using you. To understand the trait, you have to understand the man who accidentally gave it a name. Niccolò Machiavelli was not a tyrant. He was not a warlord. He was a civil servant in Florence, a diplomat who spent years observing the brutal, shifting politics of Renaissance Italy up close, watching princes rise through brilliance and fall through naivety, watching alliances form and dissolve in a single season, watching idealists get crushed by men who understood power and were not afraid to use it. Then his world collapsed. The Medici family returned to power. Machiavelli was accused of conspiracy, imprisoned, tortured, and exiled to a small farm outside the city. Stripped of everything, he did the only thing left available to a brilliant mind with nothing to lose, he wrote. The Prince was his attempt to distill everything he had witnessed into a single, brutally honest manual on how power actually works, not how philosophers wished it worked, not how priests said it should work, but how it actually, observably, functioned in the real world. And buried in that book is a chapter that, even 5 centuries later, reads less like political advice and more like a psychological diagnosis of the human condition. Chapter 25. Chapter 25 of The Prince asks a question that every single person watching this video has asked themselves in a moment of failure. How much of my life is actually in my control, and how much of it is just luck? Machiavelli's answer is strange, balanced, and oddly comforting. He suggests that roughly half of our outcomes are governed by fortune, the unpredictable tides of circumstance, timing, and chance. But the other half, he insists, is governed by something he calls virtù, not virtue in the moral sense, but a fusion of skill, boldness, adaptability, and preparedness. To explain this, he uses an image that has survived 500 years for a reason. He compares fortune to a violent, swollen river. When the river floods, it tears down trees, destroys buildings, and reshapes entire landscapes. People flee before it, helpless, because the water moves faster than human will. And here is the insight that built empires: that same river is only catastrophic to the people who failed to prepare during the calm season. The communities who built dikes, dams, and channels long before the flood arrived are not swept away when the storm comes. They redirect the water. They survive what destroys everyone else, not because they were lucky, but because they were ready before they needed to be. This is the entire philosophy compressed into one image. Fortune will come for everyone eventually. The flood is not optional. What is optional is whether you spent the calm season building, or whether you spent it pretending the storm would never arrive. Machiavelli goes further. He argues that bold, decisive action consistently outperforms cautious hesitation, because circumstances change faster than overly careful people can adapt. The prince who waits for perfect conditions before acting is a prince who waits forever, while the world moves on without him. Boldness, timed correctly, bends fortune. Hesitation, more often than not, simply surrenders to it. Notice what this chapter is actually about. It is not really about princes or thrones or armies. It is about psychology. It is about the internal architecture of a mind that refuses to be a passive passenger in its own life. A mind that assumes responsibility for preparation, reads situations clearly instead of emotionally, and acts decisively when the moment calls for it instead of waiting for permission from fate. That mindset, strategic, prepared, unsentimental about outcomes, is the seed from which modern psychology grew an entire personality trait. So what does this actually look like inside a human skull? Researchers studying high Machiavellian individuals have found something counterintuitive. These are not unintelligent, hot-headed bullies. In fact, many high scorers possess above-average social intelligence. They are excellent at reading people, sometimes frighteningly good at it. They notice the micro-expression that flickers across a face for half a second. They notice who is insecure, who is desperate for approval, who is hiding something. They are exceptional students of human behavior. The crucial difference is what they do with that information. A psychologically healthy, emotionally warm person uses social intelligence to build connection, trust, and mutual benefit. A high Machiavellian mind uses the exact same raw skill, the same read on human behavior, purely as a lever. The information becomes a tool, not a bridge. There is also a distinct emotional signature. Neuroscience research on dark triad traits suggests that high Machiavellian individuals often show reduced emotional reactivity in situations that would distress most people: conflict, confrontation, even mild cruelty. This isn't necessarily because they feel nothing. It's often closer to a kind of strategic emotional distancing, keeping feeling at arm's length, so it doesn't interfere with calculation. While a more agreeable person might feel guilt creep in before they even finish a manipulative sentence, the high Machiavellian brain treats emotion as data to monitor in others and as noise to suppress in themselves. This produces a particular cognitive style psychologists call cold cognition, decision-making that prioritizes logic, outcome, and self-interest over emotional or moral intuition. It's the same mental machinery a skilled negotiator uses at a high-stakes business table, or a poker player uses while holding a terrible hand and an unreadable face. The difference between a healthy version of this skill and a destructive one is not the skill itself, It's the intention behind it, and the boundaries placed around it. You don't need a royal court to see this trait in action. It shows up in break rooms, group chats, and family dinners. Picture an office where a major promotion is on the table. One employee, we'll call him the builder, spends months perfecting his actual output, staying late, refining reports, quietly mastering his role. Another employee, we'll call her the strategist, spends that same time differently. She studies the decision makers. She learns which manager values loud confidence over quiet competence. She positions herself to be visible in meetings where leadership is watching, even when her actual contribution that week was smaller than the builder's. She times her wins to land right before performance reviews. When the promotion is announced, it goes to the strategist not because she worked harder, but because she understood that perception, timing, and positioning are also forms of work, and she built her dikes long before review season arrived. The builder feels betrayed by a system that seems unfair. The strategist would tell you with total sincerity that she simply read the river correctly. Or picture two friends negotiating who pays for what on a group trip. One operates from pure trust, assuming things will balance out fairly over time. The other, more strategically minded, quietly tracks who has paid for what, frames requests in ways that make refusal feel awkward, and consistently angles group decisions toward outcomes that benefit them, never lying outright, just shaping the frame everyone else is reacting to. Months later, the trusting friend realizes they've been subtly outpositioned in almost every shared decision, without a single dramatic confrontation ever happening. Or consider a salesperson negotiating a major contract. A purely emotional negotiator either caves under pressure to keep the peace, or explodes when pushed too far, both reactions controlled by the other side. A psychologically Machiavellian negotiator does neither. They stay detached from the emotional temperature of the room entirely. They let silences sit uncomfortably long. They appear unbothered by deadlines that are quietly terrifying the other party. They are not colder because they feel less, they are colder because they have trained themselves not to let feeling drive the decision. None of these people are cartoon villains twirling a mustache. They are ordinary people who have, consciously or not, tilted their internal dial further towards strategy than sentiment. And once you see this pattern, you start noticing it everywhere in negotiations, in friendships, in families, in your own reflection. Before this starts sounding like an instruction manual for becoming ruthless, here is the part the highlight reels always skip. Extreme Machiavellianism is not actually a winning long-term strategy. It is a short-term weapon with long-term structural damage built into its blade. Research on dark triad traits consistently finds that very high Machiavellianism correlates with shallow, short-lived relationships. Higher rates of being distrusted once patterns are noticed, and lower long-term life satisfaction, even when short-term wins, promotions, deals, social victories pile up impressively. The strategy works beautifully against people who haven't seen it before. It works far worse against people who have, because once someone identifies the pattern, every future interaction with them is colored by suspicion. And trust, the very currency that makes cooperation, loyalty, and lasting success possible, quietly evaporates. There's a psychological term for what tends to happen to extremely high scorers over time: relational erosion. They win individual rounds and slowly lose the larger game, because human beings, as a species, are remarkably good at eventually detecting who is playing them and remarkably unforgiving once they do. The strategist from the office story might win this year's promotion. But the moment her colleagues start comparing notes and realize how consistently the pattern repeats, doors quietly begin closing that no level of strategic positioning can reopen. Because the currency she spent isn't recoverable, it's reputation, and reputation has a long memory. This is the part Machiavelli himself actually understood, even if pop culture forgot it. The Prince isn't a celebration of cruelty. For its own sake, it's repeatedly cautious about excessive cruelty backfiring, about a ruler who is hated eventually losing everything, about strategy without any anchor becoming self-destructive. The book's real argument was never be evil, it was be effective. And effectiveness requires clear eyes about how the world actually works, including the eventual cost of being found out. So here is the actual point of this video, and the reason this isn't just psychology trivia, it's a tool for your life. You do not need to become more manipulative to benefit from understanding the Machiavellian brain. You need to become more aware of it in others, and of it in yourself. Awareness is the dike you build before the flood arrives. Think about every time you felt confused after a conversation, sensing that something was off but unable to name it. That feeling is often your own pattern recognition system detecting strategic behavior before your conscious mind has caught up. Learning the psychology of Machiavellianism gives language and structure to that gut feeling, which means you stop being blindsided by it. Think about every time you've lost a negotiation, a promotion, or an argument, not because your position was weaker, but because you let emotion drive a decision that should have been driven by clear-eyed strategy. The lesson from chapter 25 isn't manipulate people. The lesson is stop being purely reactive to fortune and start building structures of preparation before the crisis arrives. There is a version of strategic thinking that is not cruel, not deceptive, and not exploitative, but is still sharp, still prepared, still unwilling to be a passive victim of circumstance. Psychologists sometimes call this enlightened self-interest or ethical assertiveness. The ability to read situations clearly, anticipate consequences, advocate firmly for yourself, and act decisively without needing to deceive or harm anyone to do it. The builder in our office story didn't need to become the strategist's twin to win. He needed to borrow one piece of her toolkit: visibility, timing, positioning, while keeping his own foundation of genuine competence and integrity intact. That combination, skill plus strategic awareness, beats either skill alone or manipulation alone almost every single time over a long enough timeline. If Machiavelli's river metaphor is the heart of this entire philosophy, then here is how you actually build your dikes before the flood arrives. 5 practical shifts drawn directly from the psychology of this trait, stripped of its cruelty and kept sharp at the edges. First, separate information from emotion when it matters most. Before a high-stakes conversation, ask yourself what is actually true and strategically relevant here, separate from how you feel about it. This single habit is the foundation of cold cognition, used constructively clear-eyed assessment instead of emotional whiplash. Second, study timing the way a strategist studies a chessboard. Many people fail not because their idea was bad, but because they presented it at the wrong moment. Exhausted decision makers, distracted rooms, bad timing in a fiscal quarter. Read the room before you read your script. Third, build your reputation as your real currency, not your cleverness. Unlike short-term manipulation, trust compounds. A reputation for being capable, fair, and reliable opens doors that no amount of clever positioning can open. Because people extend opportunity fastest to those they don't have to watch carefully. Fourth, prepare before the crisis, not during it. Whatever your version of the flood looks like: a layoff, a breakup, a market downturn, a health scare, the people who survive it well are rarely the ones who reacted fastest in the moment. They're the ones who built savings, skills, and relationships during the calm season, long before they needed them. Fifth, and most importantly, know your own dial setting. Take an honest look at where you currently sit on the spectrum between blind trust and calculated strategy. If you lean too far toward naive trust, you will keep getting outmaneuvered by people who read situations more carefully than you do. If you lean too far toward cold calculation, you will keep winning battles while quietly losing the war for genuine connection. The goal isn't zero, and it isn't maximum. The goal is calibrated, strategic enough to never be blindsided again, warm enough to never be alone at the finish line. Fortune does not negotiate. The flood does not check whether you feel ready. Somewhere ahead of you this year, maybe this month, a version of that river is already rising, completely indifferent to whether you've prepared for it. Machiavelli wrote chapter 25 from the wreckage of his own collapsed career, stripped of power, exiled from the city he loved, with nothing left but a brutally clear understanding of how the world actually works. And from that wreckage, he didn't write a lament. He wrote a blueprint. The Machiavellian brain, at its most dangerous, is a tool of manipulation. But the same psychology, understood and redirected, is something far more valuable, a clear-eyed, unsentimental, deeply prepared way of meeting a world that was never going to be fair to begin with. You don't need to become cold to survive the flood. You need to stop pretending the flood isn't coming. Start building now while the water is still calm.